Hello. This week we are going to be looking at one of our more serious topics in U.S. history, the issue of slavery, specifically leading up to the Civil War. Now, this is, again, one of our more serious topics here. It's going to take a level of maturity as well. As we go through this week, we are going to be looking at some of the narratives from former slaves about what their life was like and what they experienced. But for our notes this week, we're going to look more at background. Why did slavery grow in the United States? And what were some of the common resistances, we should say, to the growth of slavery? So some of the vocab that we're going to be looking at, you have the cotton gin, abolition, Frederick Douglass, Nat Turner, the Fugitive Slave Act, the Underground Railroad, and Harriet Tubman. And again, the kind of the big questions that I'm going to be focusing on. Why did slavery grow, even after the United States banned the import of slaves? And what were some forms of resistance to the growth of slavery? So in the late 1700s, when this country is first coming together, we start to see the growth of textile mills in New England. Now, textiles are just, well, cloth, really. But what you need for cloth is cotton. Cotton's this little plant, very fibery. However, the plant can be kind of thorny, and there's really, really small seeds in that. And it was not the most easy thing, not just to pick, but to clean as well, to be made into textiles, which we have an example of there. However, in 1794, we have the invention of the cotton gin, originally like the cotton engine. And this is just a hand-powered box, but which made separating cotton fiber from its seeds a lot quicker. And so the statistic that I found about this is originally someone could separate the seeds from the fiber. They could do about maybe a pound of cotton a day. With the invention of the cotton gin, however, we see that escalate to 50 pounds a day. So all of a sudden, someone can clean a heck of a lot more cotton, which can then be sold. Around the same time, 1808, Congress actually bans the imports of slaves from foreign territories. But as textile mills become more prominent, specifically in the North, they're going to need more cotton to operate. And that's where the South comes in. So it's easy to think that the South is really the focus of where all the slavery, and that's where all the slavery is. But it's not like the North was completely innocent of this. They were using the cotton from the South to actually go ahead and make it into textiles and sell it. And so even though slavery is, or the import of slaves is banned, we do see slavery grow specifically in those southern states. And states become either free states where they do not allow slavery, or they are slave states. And as more and more territory out west becomes states, they get to decide if they're going to be a free state or a slave state. We're going to get into that a little bit more because it really leads into the Civil War. But some of the more important things I think we need to be aware of, prior to the Civil War, before the 1860s, we see that three-fourths, 75% of all the world's cotton comes from the South, and that is a huge, huge amount. Around 1860, again, right before the Civil War there, we are counting about 4 million slaves in the United States, pretty much making up a third of the southern population. There are entire communities where there are more slaves than free whites there. And we do have this vision of these big, large plantations that had many, many slaves on them. But most slave owners were poorer than having just a giant plantation. They would be smaller farmers and had maybe five or less slaves in their possession. There are many white farmers who could not afford slaves, but they could rent them out as well. And even with those poor farmers, again, who couldn't necessarily afford slaves, there was this idea that, they were racially superior because they could not be enslaved. So there is definitely this aspect of racism in Southern slavery. So we're going to actually get into what slavery looked like in class. So I'm not going to dig into that too much for your notes here. But I do want to look more specifically at the resistance to slavery. There were a lot of whites, definitely specifically in the North, who were calling for abolition and freed blacks there that were as well, or escaped slaves. The idea that slavery needed to be outlawed. We have a giant abolition movement, or an abolition movement that slowly gains more and more popularity as time goes on. Excuse me. Perhaps one of the more famous examples from the abolition movement was Frederick Douglass, whose his whole story is fascinating to begin with. He was born a slave. He escaped in Baltimore, I believe, and actually was almost caught on his way to escape on a train ride, but was able to learn how to read and write and became a very prolific writer, and actually toured across the United States, even into Europe, saying how terrible the system of slavery was. Eventually, he's invited to the White House by Abraham Lincoln, um, and then goes on and on to fight for the right to vote as well. But he's probably one of the more famous examples of one of the writers, one of the top speakers of the abolition movement. So we do have people who are trying to go about the ending of slavery in a very peaceful way. However, we do have a couple of examples, handful of examples, where resistance to slavery actually becomes a lot more violent. Probably the most prolific example of this is by a gentleman by the name of Nat Turner. Ends up leading a slave rebellion of about, I want to say it was 60 slaves or whatever, and pretty much, well, slaughters all the people at the plantation that they were living on and working on. There is a big manhunt for Nat Turner and his cohorts there. Eventually, they are caught. He is hung and executed there because of that. And actually, because of some of these rebellions, we see laws uh, about slaves become stricter. So much so that we have something called the Fugitive Slave Act in both. Basically, uh, if anyone came across an escaped slave, it was their responsibility to actually turn that escaped slave in. Even if you were someone, even if you were in a free state, right? And you personally did not agree with the idea of slavery, it was up to you to actually turn slaves in according to the law. So a lot of people were upset by that. Clearly, a lot of freed slaves or escaped slaves were worried about that as well. And during this time, we also start to see the growth of the Underground Railroad, which you probably have heard of back in elementary school, but always a good time to refresh a little bit here. But this is a system of routes where runaway slaves were helped to escape to Canada or free states. Now, this is not literally underground. When we talk about underground, we're talking about kind of like hidden or not out in the open. These would be people that were pretty much escaping in the middle of the night to try to avoid capture. And the idea was to go either to the north, to the Free States, or if people go to Canada, or if you look at this map too, people actually went south as well, specifically if you're going to places like Mexico, where slavery would have been abolished as well. Perhaps the most prolific, most famous conductor, quote unquote, of the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman. And it's kind of interesting that our last batch of notes, we talked about Andrew Jackson, who is currently on the $20 bill. There is currently a push, and apparently there is going to be a switch in the near future that Harriet Tubman will be taking over on our currency on the $20 bill there. And why? Well, because she is so famous from this Underground Railroad, she apparently made over 19 visits, 19 escapes, if you will. Is said to have helped over 300 slaves escape to the north or to Canada there, and really is one of those people in history that we should probably spend a lot more time focusing on. And my sources. So where does that leave us? Well, here we have just the lead up of slavery, we see slavery building more and more as we get closer and closer to the Civil War, as we can tell. Oops, let's get back a little bit here. But as we can see here, slavery is making a very divisive, two divisive sections really in the United States, between the free states in the north and the slave states in the south. And as new territory becomes states, they kind of decide, and that's not necessarily the cleanest of issues either.